Now that we've learned about function, so let's try to write our own function. For example, in case you do not have an inbuilt function created by MQL4 that is doing what we want. For example, let's say we want to add three numbers. We do not have an existing function in MQL4 that can do such. In this lecture, we are going to write a very simple function which adds two numbers. So now, how do we write a function? So the first thing we need to do when we are writing a function is to specify that, if you recall when I was introducing you to function, I said a function returns something and at the same time do something. Sometimes a function doesn't return anything, but at the same time it do something. So basically, we need to define two things when we are creating a function or when we are defining our function. We need to define what the function will be returning and what it will be doing. So to define what the function will be returning, we need to specify what it will be returning, a data type for the function, right? For example, we need to specify that, okay, in the case where maybe our function will be returning an integer, right? We need to say int. So in general, let me write you a skeleton for a function. So you need to specify the data type, right? Data type for the function. Then you need to specify the name of the function. Name of the function, right? Then you need to give it a bracket, a round bracket, right? Then you need to specify the argument. Now, when you are specifying the argument, you need to specify the data type for the first argument, say argument 1, right? Then you put a comma in the case where you have multiple arguments. And if you do not have any argument, if you do not want to include any argument, you can leave this out to be empty, right? So in case where you want to have one argument, then you have to specify the data type for the argument, then specify the name, the argument name, right? Okay, argument 1 name. Then if you want a two arguments, you say comma, then the data type for the second argument, then you say argument 2 name. If you want three arguments, you have to specify the data type as well, then you give it a name as well, right? So argument 3 name. So in this function, let's assume you are planning to define a function that takes in three arguments, right? So you can say argument 3 name. So then you now have a curly brace like this. You open a curly brace, then you close it, right? So now, then you impute the logic of the function logic, right? So this function logic. So then you write the function logic, and if you are returning something of this data type specified, you have to return at the end, right? So you have to say return something, return something. This is something you'll be returning. That means, okay, let me just say something. So this is the skeleton of a function. So now let's write a function that adds two numbers. So it takes in two arguments, one, the first number, and the second number, right? So what should we call our function, and what will our function be returning? So if you're adding two numbers, so what type of number do you plan to take in? So if you are taking two integer number, let's take in two integer number, strictly integer number. So automatically when you add two integer, right? So it is going to, the result will be an integer. So that means we can say the data type for our function, what our function will be returning, is an integer, right? Then what is the name of our function? You can say add number, or number adder, whatever name, whatever identifier you can give. Another thing you should know is that when you are giving a name to a function, almost the same rule with when you are naming a variable applies. So you are allowed to give the name of your choice, but at the same time, you are still not allowed to give the name of your choice. So when you are writing a function, you should be careful not to use an identifier that has already been taken by MQL4. For example, I want to say on start, on start has already been taken by MQL4, so I can't do that, right? Unless I want to say maybe small letter on and this, you see, you can say that this is valid because MQL4 is sensitive, is case sensitive, so automatically the fact that the capitalization is different, so that makes it valid. So let's go ahead. So now you understand that when you're giving a name to your function, you should also be careful about an identifier or a name that has already been taken by MQL4, right? So now let's go ahead with our function, or let me say I had two numbers, whatever, right? And like I said, you need a bracket, a round bracket, right? So now the question is, how many arguments do we want our function to accept. Like I said, we just want to be able to add two numbers for now. So we can say, now, the first number, what type of data type will it be? Then we can say integer, right? Then we can say number one or value one, right? Or number one, whatever name you give. Then we can say the second number should also be an integer, and we should give it a name, which is value 2. Then we put our curly brace. So now, this is where the function logic comes in. What should be the function logic? We can say we should have another integer called result. Under the result, we can say the value 1 plus value 2. So this is going to be saying, whenever this function is called, add these two numbers together and assign the results to this variable. And lastly, return this value. So remember that we are returning an integer, and of course, in here, we are trying to return an integer. So our function is complete. Right now, our function is complete. So now, like I said, there are two cycles of a function. You have to define your function, and in the case where it has been defined, for example, the input function that we've talked about in the last few lectures, they have been defined by MQL4. Then, after defining your function, the next thing is you need to call it. You need to call it wherever you want. So now, even if I save this, of course I have to comment this out because this is a template, right? So I have to comment this out. Else, when I compile, I'm going to have an error. So this is just me defining my function. If I try to execute this, it won't do anything. And that is simply because, I'm not calling it. So when you define a function, you need to call it wherever you want. So anytime you need the function, you need to call the function. So now let's quickly do that. We can simply say alert, right? And what do we want to alert? We want to alert the whatever this function is returning. So you can see that when I open my bracket, you know what? Let me do this outside so that you will see better. So I can simply say add number, and when I open my bracket, you can see it is telling me that this particular function is returning an integer and it's taking in two parameters that are integers, right? So automatically I need to prepare for something. I need to prepare what it will be getting me, right? So I can simply say maybe x, whatever variable name I can think of. So then I'll be giving it two parameters. So you can see that I said argument and I said parameters. When you are defining your function, all the data that the function takes in so that it can operate, right, are called arguments. And when you are calling the function, all those data, when you pass down those data the function needs so that it can run, they are called parameters. So you can use it interchangeably, but professionally, when you are defining, these are called arguments. But when you are calling it, whatever data the function is expecting you to pass is called parameters, right? So now let's quickly give it the parameters. So we can say 2 and 3. Then, of course, we close the bracket, which is semicolon. So we can easily alert x, the value of x. So now, I hope you can guess what the answer will be. Now, we have defined our function, and when we were defining our function, we said our function will be returning an integer value, and this is the name of our function. It will be taking two arguments, and the first argument data type that it is expecting is an integer. We call the argument value 1, and the second argument data type is an integer as well, and we call this value 2, right? Then inside the function, what is the function? How is the function operating? What's the function logic? What the function is simply doing is adding two numbers, which is the one that is specified in the argument. So it will take this number, add it up to this, right? Then, assign whatever value this operation gives, assign it to this variable, and it is returning this variable. And of course, this variable is an integer. So, and of course, we already promised that we want to return an integer, right? So when we call this function, it is expecting us to pass down two parameters, which we did. And of course, in return, it will be giving us the sum of the number, right? So let me quickly save and I'll compile so that you can see this firsthand. So as usual, I will launch this. I'll just double click and you can see it is telling me 5, and 2 plus 5 is 5, right? So now let's try for another number. So let's say 7 and maybe 4, which is 11. So let me save and I'll compile. So I'll double click. You can see 11. So that is that on simple function. In general, when you are writing your function, you should have two things in mind. What is my function returning and what is my function doing? So sometimes a function might return nothing, right? But it is doing something. And at the same time, sometimes the function is returning something and at the same time doing something. So when you are defining your function, since you already decided what is my function returning, that will lead you, so that will guide you on the data type your function will be returning. And for this, that will guide you on the data type. Then you can give it a name of your choice. Also, you need to specify arguments if your function is willing to take in an argument, maybe to do some operation. Then you need to specify the data type for each argument and separate each argument with a comma. So using an int is just to make this simple, right? In general, when you're adding two numbers, you shouldn't restrict your user to only put in an integer. So by default, this should have been a double because someone can decide to say 7.5, right? And in that case, since you are expecting an integer, so this 7.5 will be rounded up into an integer, will be rounded up into the nearest integer, right? Then for this, we can simply say, you know what, we are expecting an integer, right? I mean, we are expecting the double. Also, we are expecting the double. For this, when you had two decimal numbers, of course, you should be expecting a double, which is a decimal number, and that is that. So that's just a quick fix. And here you can see finally, and by the time by the time we say comma, you can see it's now telling me that the result of this will be a double because that is what I specified when I was defining my function. So you can go back to the first lecture of this section, which is introduction to function, so that you can understand. In case where you are unable to understand all of what I just said in this lecture, and in the case where you are able to understand, you can move forward to the next one because as we move forward, we are going to write a more complex function. So, and if you do not understand the basic of writing function, you might have difficulty understanding other lectures, right? So that is that for our first function. On the next lecture, we write another function until we are comfortable writing functions, right? So I'll see you on the next one.